Yeah, so I'm very happy to be here, and I'm really happy about this invitation. And from the surveys or questionnaires at the beginning, this seems to be a very mixed audience, and I think this is also very nice to have to discuss results that are in this talk now rather focusing on two very recent PhD projects and a strong focus on pollination. But I think this can also be, seen from very different angles. And I'm looking forward to, your opinion, your thoughts, and your questions in the end. So, Monica introduced me in a way with the scope of my group or lab here at the university. And when I started here or writing the grant proposal, we discussed a lot where the way should go. And one major thing we'd like to tackle is that we consider that we need agricultural production and that these systems are very important for human beings, because there will be an increasing world population that needs to be fed. And this is shown on these two graphs, like the predicted increase until 2015, and also the predicted potential yield or cereal crop production that is needed to feed the population. So we have, on the one hand, this demand. At the same time, and this is I'm sure you're all aware of, we have also considerable problems within the agricultural systems, and there is ongoing land use change, and there is also an ongoing expansion of arable land uses. And so the idea, which is basically not my idea, it was promoted by Ricardo Bamarco, of ecological intensification and many other ideas of more sustainable development in agricultural systems, is that we try to transform the systems in a way that they can sustain our environment with its biodiversity at the same time with high productivity to have or fulfill these demands. But currently we are rather on this path, which is nicely illustrated in these figures here. We had a very diverse cultural landscape, and this is mainly focusing on the global north, so let's say Central Europe or North America, with small scale, highly diverse agricultural landscape patterns. And through different changes like land consolidation, simplification of crop sequences, and the external inputs such as fertilizers or pesticides, the landscapes changed, but also the habitat changed. So we lost habitats were degraded, so the quality of the habitats changed, and they were fragmented. And all these resulted in a loss of biodiversity. And I'm sure you're all aware of ongoing insect declines. There were seminal papers, also one led by Wolfgang Weisser's group in Freising. And these species losses, they also affect the functions within our systems. So we lose functional diversity. The communities tend to be more homogenized, and this is what I will show you later on as well. And with that, we also lose functions and services which are of great importance for agriculture. And when I already talked about this ecological intensification. So the idea behind this concept basically is that, in the sense, some production factors might be limited and they are now increased with external inputs, and they should be replaced by biodiversity or services in the ecosystem. So the idea is to reduce inputs by enhancing natural functions of the ecosystems so that we can maintain high yields, reduce the inputs, and have a more sustainable way of production in the end. And there are many different practices all over the place, and they have already been studied quite well. And Giovanni Tamburini compiled a second order meta-analysis. So he and his colleagues looked at already published studies, meta-analyses that focused on these diversification strategies. And what they found that this can hold. So this idea can really be worthwhile, as they found mainly positive responses of these different diversification practices, and some neutral ones and some negative ones. So there is variation in the outcomes, but in general, there is a potential that could make it worthwhile to try out this strategy. And one thing which we do here for a long time, and that has largely been established by Thea Charnke, is the idea that you cannot focus on a single field where you reduce tillage or where you enhance the flowers through flower strips, but you at the same time have to consider the surrounding landscape, because where these plots are embedded, you need or you have an effect of the surroundings. So it's just simple a neighborhood. So whether a habitat is close by or further away, how well these habitats are connected, or it's just simply the amount of either resource-rich habitats in the landscapes or the opposite, highly intensively managed agricultural fields. And so you can think of different factors or metrics at the landscape level that at the same time affect different components of biodiversity. So this can be like the local diversity in a single patch, field, grassland, or hedgerow. It can be the better diversity, so the turnover between different habitat types in the landscapes. And then you can also have a landscape-wide species pool that is strongly related to the landscape complexity. You can also think of population dynamics, so the temporal changes for pollinators, for instance, in flowering resources. Some flower over longer periods, some only short time, some are very abundant, some are rather scattered. So you have this temporal and spatial variation in resources. And this can also not only affect population dynamics, but also functional trait selection. So landscapes can filter for certain traits, for instance, for species that are very good dispersers or poor dispersers, or species that are specialized or rather generalist. And with this selection of traits, it can also have an effect on the stability of ecological processes. So if you have enough species that can ensure that a certain function will be held or will be constantly available, irrespective if there are some species dropping out or not, then you have high redundancy in the landscape of species that can offer specific functions. And then you see this hump shape curve in here. This is also one consideration you can take with this landscape perspective. So it has been shown that if you implement some measures in really poor landscapes, you can imagine that you have to have a high level of management that is necessary to really achieve an increase in either biodiversity or functioning. And at the same time, in really complex landscapes where you have already high levels of biodiversity and associated ecosystem functions, there you again have to add a lot of measures to increase this functionality. And so the idea here is that the efficiency of measures or management efforts is highest in landscapes that are of an intermediate landscape complexity. So you have some species, but you can promote them quite easily with some diversification measures. And this is the concept behind our research, basically. And now I'd like to start off with rather small scale effects, what I called here neighborhood effects and spillover effects, and then later take you to larger scale landscape studies focusing on different aspects of landscape heterogeneity. But now we start first with this rather small scale neighborhoods. This was a master thesis that has been conducted by Denise Castle, and it was in our agricultural landscapes around Göttingen, where we have still a rich mix of arable field, grasslands, and hedgerows. And we also have some forest areas in the landscape. And so our idea behind this study was that we test how well-connected hedgerows affect pollination functions. And this is our experimental design. And we thought the better the hedgerows are connected, the better they, or the more pollinator functions they will provide, because there are more pollinators and they have a higher effect on the fruit set. At the same time, we also thought about disservices, and one antagonist, which is quite prevalent in our landscape, is the pollen beetle, Miligis, and so we took these little guys also into account. And then we selected hedgerows that were either connected to forest edges, that were isolated within the landscape, and here in gray you see grassy field margins. And on these grassy field margins in these different neighborhoods, we placed strawberry phytometer plants on which we monitored the pollen beetles, the pollinators, and also the fruits in terms of quality and quantity. And this is what I would like to start with. So first of all, we first checked whether insect pollination or flower visitation has an effect on fruit sets. This is well known, but just to be safe, whether our experiment works, we excluded pollinators with little bags, and we found higher berry weights in the open pollinated treatment. So this is what one would definitely expect. And then here are the results for our different hedge types. So this is the well-connected hedge, which had the highest berry weight, then followed by the isolated hedge, where there was no forests close by, and then the lowest weight was in the grassy margins. So we found that the berry weight definitely increased with habitat connectivity of these hedgerows. Then we also looked at the fruit quality, and I think this is the first talking during strawberry harvest about strawberries. So when you now go to the supermarket, there will be this little basket with the strawberries, or you go to the field and you pick them yourself. And of course, you will spot these really nice, well-formed big strawberries. And if you classify them into these commercial grades, they will be either extra or grade 1. And then we have some that only will yield grade 2. These have some malformations, and if you buy these little baskets, you always have some of them in there, so they are still marketable. But then there are these little guys, they are really small and they are totally deformed, and they are non-marketable, and then they will go in whatever strawberry products you can think of. And we did this classification according to these commercial grades. Again, for the strawberries, we harvested from our pollinate or from our phytometer plants, and again from our pollination treatments. And here we found the treatment worked. So the open pollinated flowers, they had the highest commercial grades for the berries. And for our hedgerows, we also found again this pattern which we have seen for the berry weight. So this is correlated. So we had the highest shares of commercial grade extra and 1 next to the connected hedges, followed again by these isolated hedges, and on the grassy margins we had the highest proportion of non-marketable fruit. And if you calculate the difference between the connected hedge and the grassy margin, it will be roughly a 30% increase in terms of economic outcomes. And this will be roughly €5 per 1,000 berries. So this habitat connectivity also enhanced the outcomes for the farmers. And now I'd like to just briefly have a look at our mutualists and antagonists and how they affected the berry weight. So we had very low visitation rates, but still could demonstrate that there was an increase with visiting Hymenopteran and Dipteran individuals on our berries. And there was also a negative effect of Meleagetes visitation. But when we looked at our experimental setting, we could clearly see that the pollinators were enhanced through the well-connected hedges, and they were counteracting the negative effects of these antagonists. And Meleagetes was just present all over the place, so they didn't show any clear patterns in terms of habitat connectivity. And so this is why we finally can conclude that these enhanced spillover from forest edges to hedgerows to our phytometer plants can definitely benefit strawberry production. And so now, as promised, I will take you up to the landscape scale and always consider both levels, so the field level and the landscape scale level. And these are really recently finished PhD projects. So I didn't do the field work. I was just supervisor of Nicole Bayer and Svenja Bench. And I decided today not to have like all topics covered, but rather tell a bit more stories about the work in detail. And for this reason, I would like to start with the PhD project of Nicole Bayer, which was a larger collaborative project where we were the Pollinator working package. And we also had a predation and biological control package, but I'm not presenting those results now. I will focus again on the pollinators. So it is well known that legumes and crop sequences can have beneficial effects. They can, for instance, result in reductions of N fertilizer. They can increase the yields of following crops, and as they also provide floral resources, as you can see on the picture here, they can also promote flower visiting insects, either through the flowers or even extrafloral nectaries. And they are part of the system of the Common Agricultural Policy of the EU. So farmers can get payments out of the first pillar if they sow legumes as ecological focus area. But as even pesticides are allowed in these focus areas, it's highly controversial whether this should be definitely a greening measure or not. So, and with this setting, we started a project on faba beans to see what their effects are. And here I also would like to emphasize that there's a lot of research been done of faba beans in terms, there's just, can you see the Umfrage? I'll close this. There's a lot of work done in organic agriculture, but not so much in conventional agriculture. And we're here focused only on conventional crop sequences. And we hypothesized that the faba beans will have a beneficial effect on the wild bee densities in both field margins and also semi-natural habitats that are embedded in the agricultural matrix. We also tested whether faba bean cultivation moderates the functional composition of the bee community, so whether there are certain filters for some species traits like sociality or preference for certain food plants, and whether then these Fabaceae foraging species are promoted. And we also figured out whether landscape and faba bean cultivation can have beneficial effects on faba bean yields. And of course, we did not only consider faba beans, but also other landscape elements and how they interact with the local flower cover. This was our experimental design. So we had 3 regions where we selected paired field or study landscapes. Each landscape was 1 square kilometer of size, and In our faba bean landscapes, there was at least one faba bean field, and in our control landscapes, there were no faba beans grown for, or no legumes grown for at least the last previous 3 years. And we also paired the landscapes according to their landscape composition. So they were similar in terms of the amount of grasslands, forests, and annual crops, so that we could compare landscapes within these pairs. And then we conducted or we sampled bees either along the grassy margins of the fields or in semi-natural habitats in 2 different studies. And first, I would like to show you the results of these field margins. And there are some pictures shown here. And usually these field margins have some flowers, but not to such an extent as a flower strip or an extensive grassland could have, which we accounted as semi-natural or as bee habitats. So now we focus on the field margins, and we were able to conduct 3 sampling runs, which are shown here. And what we found is that it made a difference whether there are faba beans cultivated in the landscapes or not. And we found enhanced bumblebee densities in later in the year, so in run 2 and in run 3. When we looked at the non-bombus bees, so these were not only solitary, but also some social wild bees. That's why we termed them non-bombus bees, which is, not such an easy term, but anyhow, that's the most correct one. So for the other wild bees, we didn't find any effect of faba bean cultivation, so they didn't respond at all. But we found that they benefited from the proportion of semi-natural habitats in our landscapes. So we had increasing wild bee densities that didn't belong to the bombus genus. Again, later in the year, so in run 2 and run 3, when the proportions of semi-natural habitats in these landscapes increased. And these non-bombus bee densities were also enhanced with the local cover in these grassy margins. So the more flowers there were in the first and in the third run, the more bees were there. And we assume that this decline here in the second run is mainly due to other resources, that they got distracted from these not super attractive grassy margins. And so we can have, or we see here 2 distinct patterns for these different taxonomic groups of species. And then we also looked at the functional diversity within these bee communities. And here we found that the Fabaceae foragers, so all species that feed on legumes, were also enhanced in landscapes, again later in the season, where there were faba beans present. And in terms of another trait like body size, which can be seen as an indicator of dispersal ability, we found the more semi-natural habitats were present in the landscapes, the smaller the bees were. So to put it in an opposite perspective, smaller bees could be facilitated through better habitat connectivity through just enhanced semi-natural habitats. And now we changed the perspective. In parallel, Felix Kirsch did his master's thesis in the semi-natural parts of these landscapes. And here we found a similar enhancement for the bumblebees, but we have seen that already. And what I find very interesting is that we here had an effect of landscape diversity, in addition, again, to the flower cover, which we had earlier in the grassy strips as well. But now when we look at the semi-natural habitats, the species richness of all wild bees, so this is including the bumblebees, was increasing. So the more diverse the semi-natural habitats and flowering crops were in the landscapes, the more bee species were there. And also the more flowers we found in these habitats. So we had an interaction between local and landscape scale factors, but in terms of species richness, especially landscape diversity was very important. Again, we looked at some functional traits. Here we focused on the social bees. And here we found that faba bean cultivation enhanced the social bees. That's no surprise. The social bees are the bumblebees and some Lasioglossum and Halictus species, and they were enhanced in late and midsummer. And we had also an effect of oilseed rape, which was very interesting to see, because with increasing proportions of oilseed rape, we had more solitary bees in these landscapes. And here we can see that different crops with different floral traits can filter for different bee species in these communities. And we also had a look at the yield formation in faba beans, and we addressed many different factors, and here I focused on the seed weight per plant. And first of all, we could see that we had the positive effect of bee densities on the yield, and this was most pronounced in landscapes where we had high shares of faba beans. So this is the cover of faba beans, so not just presence, absence, but just the amount in the landscape. And we also had a positive effect of the semi-natural habitats. So here the cascading effect from higher bee densities also translated into higher yields. So from all these different studies, we can conclude that landscape composition and floral resources are having interacting effects on pollinator densities, functional community composition, and yield formation. And in our case, the specific question on whether diversified crop sequences with faba beans can have general positive effects on bee species communities, we have to say, well, not really. They enhance the bumblebees, but for the wild bees, we definitely need other measures to enhance their populations. And so we concluded basically that you need an diversification within fields where bumblebees and also long-tongued bumblebees can benefit, but at the same time, the highest priority should be given to the semi-natural habitats because they turned out to be really important for the wild bees. And with this, I would like to switch again back to the strawberries. And with this study, which was conducted by Svenja Bench, we focused more on pollination management. So there were some publications indicating that co-flowering crops can have an effect on crop pollinators, and that, for instance, like oilseed rape, showy yellow mass flowering crop can distract pollinators from less abundantly flowering strawberries. And this question is of great interest as the production of pollinator-dependent crops is increasing at a global level. And at the same time, both wild and managed pollinators show great variations, and the farmers, to minimize their risk to lose crops, need stable pollination services in these landscapes for the production of insect-pollinated crops. And we tested in these studies the hypothesis that co-flowering crops definitely have an effect on pollinator diversity and pollination services, and also that they modify the foraging behavior of the bee pollinators depending on the functional groups of pollinators. And Svenja conducted transect walks in strawberry fields that were located in landscapes which had a different cover of oilseed rape fields. And we also accounted the flowering phenology of these fields and calculated the product of oilseed rape flower cover within the fields and oilseed rape land cover in the landscapes. So we came up with this oilseed rape availability, which was changing with the flowering phenology. And again, we conducted a pollinator exclusion experiment to quantify the effects of insect pollination on yields. Interestingly, we found that these co-flowering oilseed rape had a strong effect on our bees, and this effect depended on the functional group. And we found the strongest distraction for the bumblebees. So the more oilseed rape was available in our landscapes, the more they were attracted or driven away from the strawberry fields where we did our transects. The honeybees responded in a similar way, but at the same time, the densities of the solitary bees in the strawberry fields were enhanced. So we had these contrasting foraging decisions in relation to oilseed rape availability, which in the end resulted in a more or less stable crop pollination service, because we didn't find any effect on strawberry weight of our landscape metrics. We just found, again, within our pollination experiment, that the highest weight was recorded for the open treatments. Strawberries can also self-pollinate. We had another self-pollination treatment here, and additionally with tool bags, a wind pollination treatment. But again, the open pollination was the most important one. And we also found, and this is another factor what should be taken into account when you think of pollinator management, we found effects that differed between the different varieties in our study fields. So we found an increase of strawberry weight with the bee individuals per transect for the variety Honoi, but not for the variety Sonata. But overall, we can conclude that this complementarity in resource utilization resulted basically in very stable pollination services in our strawberry fields. We then took another approach and quantified the pollen richness, and I'm sorry for the small axes here. So this is pollen richness. For that, we used metabar coding, and we found that bumblebees collect a higher richness of pollen in those landscapes, whereas honeybees collect less various pollen diets. And we were again most interested in the proportion of the strawberry pollen, which we counted rather in a traditional way using microscopy. And again, we wanted to see whether or on which landscape factors or local factors the bees react upon and how they make their foraging decisions. And what we found is that the flower cover in the fields had or with increasing strawberry flower cover, so with the amount of flowers in these fields, the proportion of strawberry pollen was increasing. So the bees collected more pollen in the strawberry fields. At the same time, with increasing oilseed rape availability, they were again distracted. So our observations were reflected or mirrored also with our pollen counts here. And we could also show that bumblebees adapt their foraging behavior if two crops are co-flowering. And this is a part I took from the previous PhD, where we again looked at pollination, crop pollination services, and this time in oilseed rape. That's why it's here now. And in this study, we considered not only the present co-flowering crops, like in the previous strawberry study, but we also considered the history of mass flowering crops, and these include oilseed rape, faba beans, but also other like clover crops if they were present in the landscapes, and how this history affects the bee densities, which is not shown here, but also the number of seeds or the seed weight. And first we found in our pollination treatment again that the open pollinated oilseed rape flowers produced a higher number of seeds per pot. And we also could demonstrate that the history of mass flowering crops, so the amount of hectares in this landscape, had a positive effect on the seed weight per plant. And what we assume is that as we also had higher bee densities in this landscape with higher amounts of mass flowering crops grown in the past, that there is cascading effects on the pollinator community. So we have higher densities that result then in higher seed weights in this case. And on this slide, I tried to sum up all these different factors that you need or should consider when you try to manage crop pollination services in Central European landscapes. First of all, you need to think about the bees, how they respond to local and landscape scale factors. And this is important to also consider the stability of crop pollination services, because as shown in the study with the strawberries, especially the social bees, they tend to strongly optimize their foraging and just leave less attractive resources. And here come the wild bees, the solitary wild bees in, that can take over the services and act as an insurance for the farmers. And when management strategies should be developed, you should think about all these aspects like temporal spatial availability and the functional traits. Also, like we saw that bee communities can get filtered by the crops that are at landscape level, and either solitary bees can be facilitated or Fabaceae forages in our cases with oilseed rape and faba bean. And one other aspect one needs to consider, and there is currently increasing amount of the research done, how different varieties, crop varieties, respond to pollination. So whether they need a lot of insect pollination or whether they are rather independent. Okay, so this was the part about the crops, and now I would take you to another important land use type in the landscapes, which is the grasslands. And this is research which has been done a couple of years ago in the biodiversity exploratories, which are large study regions in the northern part, in the Schorfheide Chorin, in the Hainich, and around Frankfurt. And what we did here is to see how landscape composition affects communities in terms of their functional traits. And we were also interested in the interaction between the local land use intensity in terms of mowing, fertilization, and grazing in relation to the landscape intensity. And as time is running, I will try to speed up a bit. We focused on two different aspects of landscape heterogeneity. So the one is the increasing configurational heterogeneity, which is the spatial pattern of habitats in the landscape, and then also the landscape diversity or compositional heterogeneity, which we already heard about. And I will skip this and just come to our main questions, which were like based on a huge synthesis data set. And we were interested how landscape patterns and local land use intensity modify traits in species communities. So whether we have highly generalized traits in intensively managed landscapes, and whether this can be mitigated by landscape heterogeneity. And for this study, we were very lucky that we could compile a huge amount of data which has been collected within these exploratories by various groups. In the end, we had almost 600 species of 6 orders in our data sets, and we assigned all species certain functional traits like activity period, body size, and feeding breath for adults and larvae. And then we related these traits to the environmental variables and weighted them by the species abundance. That's a so-called RLQ analysis. And then you can do a correspondence analysis, including the environmental components and the trait components. This is maybe something we can discuss later. I would just like to show you the results. Because we here found 3 different types of communities that were filtered by our landscapes. So when land use intensity, so the local land use on the plots, was the most important factor, we only found large generalists, so species with a wide range of dietary requirements and good dispersibility. When you look at landscape composition, we found rather feeding specialists that benefited from different habitats in the landscape, so from high landscape diversity. And the small generalists, they were enhanced in landscapes with small, well-connected habitat patches with a lot of edge densities. So what this study could show is that, again, we have different effects of landscape composition and configuration, and that they filter for certain traits in the communities. And at the same time, the landscape heterogeneity can mitigate local intensification effects. And with that, I'm at the end of my presentation. I would just like shortly to summarize. So first, we focused with one study on the importance of small-scale habitat connectivity in terms of spillover, and we could see that hedgerows that are well embedded in the matrix can enhance pollination services. Then we had a big block about pollination services in agricultural landscapes, and we saw that this is driven by many different factors that need to be considered for effective management, and these include present and past cultivation patterns, the different species groups that provide pollination services, and how they are also or landscape patterns related to the foraging decisions of bees. And with the last study, we saw that these interactions between local and landscape scale effect can help to manage landscapes in a way that we can also mitigate effects of high local intensification through the enhancement of landscape heterogeneity. And finally, I thank DFG and the Ministry of Agriculture and the DBU for funding, all the people who contributed, and you for listening, and I'm happy to take questions. And please apologize that it was a bit too long.